Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. President Joe Biden will host President Yoon Suk-yeol for a state visit marking the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. High on the agenda is strengthening extended deterrence against North Korea and high-tech cooperation. Today, we preview the summit and discuss effective deterrence against North Korea.
And the Kim regime has developed capabilities that reach beyond Seoul, Tokyo, Washington, D.C.
The DPRK is testing and publicly trumpeting its increasingly dangerous arsenal and delivery systems.
In the studio with me, Ambassador Robert Einhorn, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Ambassador Einhorn served as Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the State Department and Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation. Also joining us, Mr. Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a Washington-based policy initiative. Mr. Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Einhorn, how does Washington view the significance of the upcoming Biden-Yoon summit?
I think all of Washington looks at this upcoming state visit as very significant. And when I say, and I mean all of Washington, the executive branch, the Congress, where President Yoon will be giving a presentation to a joint session of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, I think they're united in their view. South Korea has become a critical, even indispensable partner in addressing today's critical challenges. And not just on the Korean Peninsula, but also regionally and even globally. U.S. and ROK administrations have rarely been as closely aligned as they are today. And I think the upcoming state visit provides an opportunity not only to celebrate 70th anniversary of the alliance, and there's a lot to celebrate, but it's also an opportunity to chart the course for the period ahead, as well as to try to find solutions for some key issues and to make progress on those issues, such as economic security, extended deterrence, scientific and technological cooperation. I think there's a real opportunity.
Mr. Colby, President Yoon also told a recent interview that Taiwan issue is now a global issue. It's not just between Taiwan and China anymore. Now, do you think in terms of Taiwan contingency, would the United States want South Korea to send its troops to Taiwan? And some scholars say that when there's a Taiwan contingency, North Korea may do opportunistic aggression on South Korea, and in which case the threshold for U.S. nuclear use could go lower because U.S. capabilities could be stretched. What is your take?
Well, let me unpack that a little bit. I actually have a somewhat different framing than President Yoon, which I think mirrors the Biden administration's framing. I mean, Taiwan would be God forbid, a primarily, almost exclusively an Asian war, and it would be of direct relevance to South Korea. Let's look at this problem. It's very clear, don't take it from me, take it from Xi Jinping and the extraordinary military buildup, that China is seeking at least the capability, allegedly by 2027, could be before, could be after, to take the island of Taiwan by force. Another thing I think we should anticipate that they would do is seek to potentially create crises or possibly conflict in other theaters where the United States might be committed. And of course, that means Korea. So I think in this context, the reality is that we don't know necessarily about U.S. forces in Korea itself, but every other U.S. capability, air, that would come to Korea's defense in a normal scenario would have to go to defeat the PLA. the primary threat. Now, that's not because South Korea is less important than Taiwan. It's because China is the main enemy, right? And, well, they regard us as the main enemy, I should say. I think they're a rival. I hope to avoid war. But if a war were to happen, that would be the decisive fight that we would have to allocate everything to. That could leave South Korea quite exposed. So logically, my view is, and I don't think the United States would expect South Korea to directly participate in a Taiwan scenario unless it were attacked by the Chinese, which is not impossible. But I think in that context, South Korea's primary responsibility must be to assume the primary overwhelming responsibility for its own conventional defense. It has to have a lower expectation for U.S. forces that could aid it, because we're not certain how a Taiwan fight would go. We are not certain that we would prevail, and it would certainly be very difficult and bloody. We would sustain very heavy losses. So I think that's the context in which South Korea should look at this problem, is that, North Korea might in a sense, act at China's beck and call because it's very dependent on China. But it also might act opportunistically. That would be the best opportunity for North Korea to exploit its ambitions in the South since the Korean War. So I think, or perhaps since Vietnam, that is the way that we should look at it. I think, though, another point, Yoon-jung, is that over time, the PLA threat to South Korea itself will grow. We need to look at capabilities and not intentions. And if the Chinese can mount amphibious and air and ground assault on Taiwan, which is 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait, it will be able to do the same thing to South Korea, because it's 100 miles from the Shandong Peninsula to South Korea, or maybe a little bit more. Now, that doesn't mean that China will want to annex South Korea, but it could use that capability coercively. So South Korea will, I believe, over time need to work ever more closely with the United States, not only to defend against North Korea, but also to anticipate this increasingly direct Chinese threat.
Now, Ambassador Einhorn, North Korea is also a key topic in the summit between Presidents Yoon and Biden. And what President Yoon said is that he wants tangible outcome in U.S.-RK alliance response to evolving North Korean threat. What sort of assurances would President Yoon want to get from President Biden?
I think President Yoon would also like President Biden to reiterate that if North Korea were to use nuclear weapons against the U.S. or South Korea, that would mean the end of the Kim regime. I think President Biden to commit to a strong presence of U.S. strategic assets in the region. And perhaps above all, President Yoon would like South Korea to have a prominent role, a prominent voice in the development and execution of U.S. extended deterrence policies. I think having that role is very, very important to him and to the South Korean people.
On that, South Korea's top nuclear negotiator for six-party talks, former Ambassador Chun Young-woo, told a forum in Washington, D.C. recently that he said extended deterrence is as strong as can be. What South Koreans want is a sense of ownership, a sense of involvement in the nuclear planning, in the use of U.S. nuclear weapons in times of contingency. But isn't this fundamentally impossible? Doesn't U.S. president have the absolute control over U.S. nuclear weapons?
No, it's not fundamentally impossible. Yes, the President of the United States has sole authority to order the use of U.S. nuclear weapons, and that will be the case. South Koreans know and they respect this, and America's NATO allies know and respect this. The South Koreans don't want their finger on the nuclear trigger. What they want is to have a voice on whether and under what circumstances U.S. nuclear weapons will be used on the Korean Peninsula. They want to be consulted in nuclear decision-making, and they want the opportunity to weigh in, to have a voice when these critical issues are being considered, and during a crisis. And they want that voice to be expressed at the highest levels. And I think this is a reasonable request. This is their peninsula, and the prospect of nuclear war on the peninsula is of vital interest. So I think they should have the opportunity to weigh in, and I think it would be a good idea to create special procedures or a special channel by which the South Korean president could make his views on behalf of the South Korean people, make his views known to the President of the United States in a crisis.
North Korea has recently unveiled Hwasong 18 solid fuel ICBM, meaning there will be less warning time. Then would there be enough time for South Korea and the United States to consult about whether to preempt North Korea's nuclear attack?
Well, we haven't had this situation very much, but there's not anticipated that there'll be a sudden bolt out of the view. If North Korea would ever consider using this solid-fueled ICBM capability, this would be preceded by a growing crisis, and there would be opportunity for the United States to train its intelligence resources on North Korea to see if preparations were being made. So I think there likely would be time to consider and to consult, even in a deep crisis.
Now, Mr. Colby, North Korea is showcasing a series of new weapons. Its tactical nuclear warhead, solid fuel ICBM, Hwasong 18, and then also underwater nuclear attack drone. So under the circumstances with North Korea's sophistication of weapons, is it only natural that South Koreans feel nervous and that they want their own nuclear deterrent, or they want to get nuclear assurance from the United States?
Look, I'll be frank. I think there's a very real and serious issue that cannot be papered over, and it's not, reassurance is not sufficient. And I think the greater anxiety from South Korea is something that comes from a genuine and clear-headed place. Here's the way I look at it. North Korea is increasingly developing an array of nuclear weapons that can not only hold South Korea and, of course, Japan at risk, but also the U.S. homeland with devastating effect. And it would be increasingly difficult to interdict or preempt all of them. I mean, preemption might be a last-ditch effort, but our experience with preemption suggests caution in how much we rely on it. Look at our failure in 2003, when we had a very, much more advantage over a sanctioned Iraq than we would over North Korea. Here's the problem, to put it very bluntly. And Bob and I were discussing this earlier. During the Cold War, it was possible to think that extended deterrence was worthwhile and credible because the scale of what the Soviets threatened was so great that it made sense for Americans to threaten, to lose cities at home over the interests at stake. And I think you can make a similar argument about China. China is such a huge power. It's the first peer superpower in 150 years to the United States. You can imagine saying, this is worth, losing really a lot of people, God forbid, over for the United States. North Korea is not enough of a danger to the United States itself, and what happens on the Korean Peninsula in isolation is not enough of a danger, I think, for Americans to say, we're going to lose a number of cities. So this puts an untenable sort of pressure, I think, on extended deterrence. So I think we need a better solution than what I commonly see, which is we need more reassurance, we need more consultation. I think consultation is epiphenomenal or superficial on the fundamental era. I don't know what the correct solution is, but I think we will need to look more at things like what we did in the Cold War to try to have a genuine sense that this is, that there is a credible and at least somewhat rational response to a potential North Korean attack or threatened attack, more probably.
South Korean people who want to get their own nuclear weapons cite the very same reason which you just cited, that U.S. may not give up its own city to protect South Korea. In which case, do you think it makes only logical sense that South Korea develop nuclear weapon at this point?
Well, I wouldn't advise South Korea to do that. I would advise our government to take it much more seriously. And I mean, my impression is that North Korea policy is a little bit on autopilot in the United States. There's a lot else going on. There's, of course, China. There's the war in Ukraine. There's a sort of a hope that the North Korea problem will stay in its corner, but I don't think that's reasonable for us to assume. So I think we should take the South Korean concern very seriously, and we should be prepared to make changes or moves to our posture and so forth that are far beyond increased consultation. I would not advise South Korea. I would certainly not advise South Korea to kind of covertly or in contravention to U.S. Policy to pursue a nuclear weapon. I think it would be disastrous for South Korea to try to autonomously develop its own nuclear weapons program in contravention of the United States, because the only solution in whatever the future holds is going to be the South Korea and U.S. alliance together.
Now, Mr. Colby, in 2019, you told VOA that it is more important to abide by the NPT rather than developing South Korea's own nuclear weapons. Situations have changed since 2019. North Korea has a series of ICBMs. It has underwater attack drones. Do you think now the security threat outweighs the need to abide by the NPT?
That's up for the South Korean government and the American government to work it out together. During the Cold War, for instance, we were able to find, instead of having wide-scale proliferation in NATO, we deployed U.S. nuclear forces forward, and our allies were able to actually have some degree of, not custody, but at least some degree of influence and even control in nuclear forces and in the planning. I think that's one option that we could look to before we look to more drastic measures. But I think, I think the situation is now untenable, essentially, with the legacy approach. So everything needs to be on the table, certainly everything that's consistent with our international obligations.
Ambassador Einhorn, a lot of threads to pull there from what Mr. Colby just told us. What would you like to add?
Well, I agree with Bridge that it's understandable that South Koreans are anxious about the current predicament they're in with the growing North Korean threat. But I don't think the solution is for South Korea to acquire its own indigenous nuclear weapons capability. I think there would be real downsides to such action. I'll just enumerate a number of them. I do think it would weaken the U.S. ROK alliance, which Bridge says that's at the heart of deterring North Korea. I think the alliance would be weakened. I think with South Korea and North Korea facing off against each other, there'll be a destabilizing and expensive nuclear arms competition between the two of them. I think there would be a risk that China would react very negatively against a South Korean action. Not least, nuclear cooperation with other countries would be cut off. Members of the nuclear suppliers group would have to do that. And South Korea relies entirely on imports of enriched uranium to fuel its nuclear power reactors. And that could mean the end of South Korea's reliance on nuclear power for close to 30% of its electricity. This would be a severe hit. No, I don't think going nuclear is the answer, but I think a solution really needs to be worked out, and it needs to be worked out in cooperation with the United States. And I think the solution is reinforcing substantially the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent.
Mr. Colby said national security trumps non-proliferation principles. Now, if South Korea pursues nuclear weapons, in the age of great power competition, when United States wants its allies to unite with the United States against China, would it be an easy choice for United States to break an alliance with South Korea just because South Korea develops nuclear weapons?
I don't think the United States would want South Korea as a nuclear ally against Russia and China. To have that kind of a confrontation. The United States and South Korea have a unique, integrated military command. And I think this integration, these combined forces, are what contributes so substantially to deterrence. I think having two centers of nuclear decision-making within the alliance would be a real complication and an inhibition on coordinating a deterrent strategy against North Korea or against China ultimately. I think it would be. I think overall deterrence would be weakened. I think better for them to cooperate, working together with essentially one center of nuclear decision making, but working together much more closely to share responsibility, to give South Korea a more prominent role in the execution of U.S. extended deterrence policies. I think that's possible.
Even NPT, Article 10, says member nations can have the right to withdraw from NPT if there is a supreme interest of its country jeopardized.
Yes, no question. South Korea's supreme interests are jeopardized by North Korea's nuclear program and nuclear threats. And so it would be legally available for South Korea to take advantage of the Article 10 withdrawal provision. But it's not a question of whether it's legally available. The question is whether it's wise, whether it's in South Korea's interest to do that.
Now, Mr. Colby, you said that it will be a difficult choice for United States to sacrifice its city to protect South Korea. It's not the first time I'm hearing this. Many people, other people are saying this too. And President Trump in 2016, when he was a Republican presidential frontrunner, he indicated that he might support Japan and South Korea get nuclear weapons because he said U.S. cannot be a police of the world. And unfortunately, we're living in a nuclear world. How is it in the U.S. government officials, in the political circles? Is there a growing recognition that South Korea should develop its own nuclear weapons?
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that. What I would say is that the U.S.-South Korea alliance is critical for both of us. I mean, obviously, the United States is especially important for South Korea. Without the United States, you are essentially vulnerable to coercion by the Chinese. You would not be able to sustain yourself, especially because South Korea is right in the middle. I always say, South Korea is not New Zealand. New Zealand, at the end of the day, it's next to Antarctica. South Korea is too important to be ignored. So the safest course of action is either to be either with China or with the United States. And I think, without being too patting ourselves on the back, I think we're the better option, partially because we're more distant. I mean, the Chinese obviously have a long history of coercion of Korea. I think what I would mean here is that, in this context of great power competition, everything must be reassessed and increasingly is being reassessed. What I would say is that, for instance, in the context of NATO, the United Kingdom and France have independent deterrents, nuclear deterrents, that are considered to be officially by NATO to contribute to the security of the alliance. The United States also has nuclear sharing arrangements in the NATO context. So there are a number of models. I think the most important thing here is for us to work together and to take each other's concerns very seriously.
Can I just add, we've all discussed now that an independent South Korean nuclear capability would not necessarily mean the end of the U.S.-ROK alliance. I mean, the U.S. was not pleased when France decided to have its own independent nuclear capability, but France and the United States are still close NATO allies. So it won't end the alliance. But what would it happen? I think it would erode the alliance. How? I think Americans would ask themselves, why should we station all of these troops in South Korea when the South Koreans apparently no longer trust us? When those troops could become more vulnerable to the destabilizing conditions that would now be on the Korean Peninsula. And there would be, I think, decreased support for those troop levels. They might be reduced. U.S. troops might be withdrawn altogether. And I think one of the factors that is most important in deterring the North is American troop presence, having skin in the game, and this integrated military command structure, which is so vital. If that were to end, I think that would erode deterrence tremendously, which is one reason I think it would be a bad idea for South Korea to have nuclear weapons on its own.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Colby, Ambassador Einhorn, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Inchang.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.